Okay, we're recording. Hey, Stephen, good morning. Thanks for taking the time and welcome to the Nouveau podcast.
Morning, Thomas. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm a rugby nose, which is a word that my audience may not be too familiar with. How would you? So, for the people who don't really know anything about rugby in the United States, right? Where would you define where it sits in the landscape of like UK sports?
Right, that's a bit of a to start off, there's two branches of rugby, and it's going to get really into some technicalities. There's rugby union, which is globally the most popular form of rugby, but then there's rugby league, which is very popular up in the north of England and particularly in Australia. And the nuances of what makes the two different are largely around the tackle, ruck, and scrum area, which we can discuss a bit further for the American audience just now. But for the most part, I cover rugby union, and that's because I come from South Africa, where I don't actually think there is a rugby league club, and if there is, it's really small, and I don't actually know much about the South African Rugby League at all. But yeah, so rugby union is arguably either the second or third most popular sport in the UK. I would say it's the second most popular because the majority of the UK and Ireland don't play a lot of cricket. But if they did, then so England is the way England works. Obviously, it's football, soccer is number one. Then for a lot of English fans, it would be cricket second, and then rugby. But for the majority of the UK and Ireland, because obviously Ireland is not part of the UK, majority of the UK and Ireland is soccer, rugby, and then varying other sports. Ireland is a little bit different because they've got the Gaelic sports, hurling and Gaelic football. They are really up there. Some people tell me they're bigger than football, like soccer, and other people tell me it's just below. But basically, they're more popular amongst the masses than rugby would be. But yeah, rugby is one of the. It's been the quote unquote fastest growing team sport for the past 20 years. So I don't know how much it's actually grown in that period since it's been the quote unquote fastest growing, but it's one of the more impactful, one of the most followed sports in the northern hemisphere, particularly in the side that isn't in the Americas, and even in South America they follow it quite a lot. It's not obviously again not as big as football because you can't compete with the Argentinian football team and Messi and all them, but the Argentinian rugby team is growing incredibly, and their fans are amazing, and they're incredibly loyal. In South Africa, it is the second largest team sport as well. Again, behind football, purely because everyone plays football. Even the rugby players play football when they grow up as kids. In Australia, rugby's not as popular as say cricket. So cricket would be the second most popular sport in Australia, and then Aussie rules football would be the most popular. Rugby league, again, as I say, has more of a popularity than rugby union at the moment, but that's down to a bit of mismanagement, the way that they took rugby off of mainstream terrestrial TV in Australia, then put it behind a paywall, and we actually have somebody on the show quite regularly, Matt Williams. He breaks down exactly what went wrong with Australian rugby and why Australian rugby is not as well supported and as well liked as it used to be. It was rugby union. And then obviously in New Zealand it is the big sport, it is the sport. New Zealand are like similar to South Africa in a way. They live, breathe and die rugby.
There we go, tour of the world there.
Yeah, I mean, it is a World Cup of. It is a true World Cup in many aspects. When the World Cup comes around this time next year.
For sure, I'm stoked for it. I didn't go to Japan, but I went to the one in 15.
Well, actually, I'm actually a little bit disappointed in a way for next year's World Cup. It's the first World Cup since 1991 that no Northern American side will take part. After obviously Portugal stunned America quite recently in the qualifiers, so it's great for Portugal because it's the first time they've ever been in a World Cup. But at the expense of the Americans, I don't really know what a World Cup looks like without America and Canada.
I mean, it probably just looks like another different two teams who won't make it out of the pool stages.
No, yeah, that is a fair point. That is a fair point.
But yeah, the American fans are always fun. I mean, so I randomly started playing rugby. I played more like as a kid, like American football, soccer, and then I got into lacrosse. I went to my high school, didn't make the lacrosse team, but then linked up with the rugby team, and then I got into it and still play and love it.
What position are you?
Depends on the team. If it's a good team, I'm like a back row.
Right.
Like a six, a small six, and then on other teams that play in the center, and I've moonlighted at fly half.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but the backs are way more fun, I would say.
Yeah, they get a lot more time to express themselves. Forwards are just run it up, crash ball, and not break your face, basically. The offensive linemen is how I would describe the majority of forwards.
For sure. So I at first growing up, before I kind of like became aware of the wider global context, I assumed that like in all these countries, rugby is the top sport because in the U.S. it's so kind of a niche thing. And then I would travel a bit and realize, oh wait, no, it's still kind of a subculture in a lot of these other places, like you described with other sports. But the most fun I think I've had is I was living in San Francisco and the World Cup Sevens came to San Francisco, and the Sevens just has a dynamite energy, and I ended up between two twin brothers from Fiji. So, it was so much fun.
Yeah, no, like for Fiji, sevens is like a cult almost. Like it is their national sport. They don't play the 15s game. Well, I mean they do, but it's not like that's not the dream. Most Fijians, when they grow up, they're like it's sevens rugby because they are just incredible at it. And I'm sure you experienced it. The way that the Fijians support their sevens is just like. There is no. I don't think there are too many other fan groups that are like the Fijians when it comes to the sevens.
For sure. So you mentioned you're from South Africa. So how did you end up? I guess going back, like where in South Africa are you from, and then how did you end up pursuing a career in sports journalism?
So I'm originally from Johannesburg, or small sort of suburb part of it called Boksburg. And I always wanted to play rugby as a kid. Grew up playing prop, front row, anywhere in the front row. And then in my final year at high school, I got a couple of injuries that basically ruled me out of ever playing it again properly, which is was a bit of a sad thing. Because I'm not going to say that I was ever good enough to be professional. I probably wasn't, but I wanted that was the dream, that was the goal. But then when that was ruled out entirely, I was thinking, okay, what are the ways that I can effectively get as close to the pitch as possible? And I looked at coaching and I looked at refereeing at the time, but neither one of them, I didn't think I was going to be good at either one of those. So then I thought, okay, cool. Sports journalism is probably the best way to go about it. I mean, getting paid to watch sport is just every kid's dream, to be honest. So I don't know why more people don't go into sports journalism. But I took a gap year and I coached a little bit, all sports, not just rugby. And that's the year that I decided 100% that I knew I wanted to be a sports journalist. So I went down to a university in South Africa called Rhodes University in Makanda, now known as, formerly known as Grahamstown. Now now the city's called Makanda, and I did my undergraduate journalism degree there. At the same time, I started working for Grokart Mail, which is the oldest independent. I don't think they're independent anymore, but they used to be the oldest independent newspaper in the country, and I started working as a general sports journalist slash trainee or whatever, covering the local rugby scene, cricket, and just all the sports in the town itself, which was a fairly... It's basically, if you want to see the historical economic divide between societies in South Africa, Makanda is the perfect example, because you go from incredibly affluent private school areas to what in South Africa we call townships or locations, and that's basically what you see when you imagine like a South African slum. I don't know. It's not a good. I don't like using the word slum, but it's probably the words that. Or when I say that, you can the American listeners will probably be able to picture what I mean. And sort of I covered all sports, and even in those townships they play a hell of a lot of rugby and a lot of cricket, a lot of soccer, because I mean those sorts of sports are available to everyone. You don't need a whole lot of equipment. All you need is really the ball and a field, and you can play. So so I started off basically taking photos of the township rugby tournaments and going out to report on them, chat to the people in the area there, and that sort of got me more and more embedded into the newspaper, because at the time the newspaper was basically taking on anyone from the university that wanted to do journalism. They threw them at the sports journalist side of it because that was the easiest sort of thing to get into. You're not going to be dealing with incredibly exactly, you're not going to deal with politics or incredibly hard news stories or like some of the more tragic sort of health journalism stuff that you see, and you're not going to be speaking to traumatized families and all that sort of thing. You're just going to be talking about who kicked the ball hard, when, why, and who got destroyed on the side of the pitch. So it's really simple. It's difficult to mess up an interview about sport if you even know a little bit about it. So that was where most of people did their training. And then from there, the sports editor of the newspaper took a job in public relations in one of the schools, and he was looking for a replacement for himself. And he basically wrote down 3 names, and I was one of those 3 names. And at the age of about, I think it was 21, I became the youngest sports editor of that particular paper ever. So I was working as a sports editor and also at the same time community journalist in my final year at university in South Africa. And so I wasn't just covering sport at that point. I was doing all those other stories, like the more hard-hitting, more traumatizing, more like I was covering protests every other weekend and all that sort of thing. And I'm sure if you've seen a South African protest on the news, they get a little bit spicy is a good way to put it. So did that for 2.5 years, and then to get over to Ireland, I looked for master's courses, and I ended up in Dublin City University's master's program for journalism, and that sort of brought me over to Dublin.
Beautiful, man. Good for you for going after it and kind of chasing your dream. Because it seems like, I guess like any pursuit needs dedication and consistency, but that's awesome that you found a way to kind of keep the dream alive. You mentioned there the township and the kind of economic divide within South Africa. So my understanding of where the Springboks, which is the South African national rugby union team, sit in the Psyche is that traditionally a very Afrikaner, which is like the white Dutch descendant group in South Africa sports, so kind of more aligned with that. And then of course there was maybe Song Victus with the 95 World Cup, maybe that was exposure. So where do the Springboks sit now in the national psyche, and does rugby still represent that kind of divide, or is it a different kind of place now?
It depends on. This is going to be a very stupid answer, but it depends on who you ask. Like there's always going to be the arguably loud minority that will say that the Springboks will always be a legacy of apartheid and will always be a thing that we should go away from. There's a movement to try and get rid of the Springbok emblem and the Springbok name and replace it with just the protea, which is the national symbol for the rest of the sports in South Africa. The national soccer team is not the Proteas, they're Bafana, but they still, but even all of the teams still have the Protea on them. It's just only the rugby team that has the Springbok over the crest. The Protea's on the other side, whereas everyone else has the Protea on the left, on the left hand of the chest. But that's the minority and the people that are still holding on to the wrongs of the past, which they have their right to do. They were incredibly harshly treated, and I'm not going to tell them not to think that. But one thing that has been incredibly telling to me is a long history lesson. After democracy came in, after 1995, there was a period of reconciliation, and all the wrongs were tried to be righted. And one of those wrongs was the fact that no person of color was allowed to represent South Africa on the sports field. So, particularly with the Springboks, Chester Williams was one of the first. He wasn't the first, but he was one of the first people of color to ever wear the Springbok jersey, and he wore it in 1995, and he won a World Cup. But before Chester Williams and one or two others, if you were black or Indian or whatever, you were not allowed to represent the Springboks, and therefore a lot of people of color that grew up in schools and everything, they didn't want to play rugby at all. They saw it as a symbol of oppression. And after 95, and basically around about 2000, 2001, the South African government wanted to rectify the lack of diversity within the national teams, particularly cricket and rugby, because everyone in the townships played soccer, so the Bafana became very majority people of color very quickly, based off of talent more than anything else. But what they wanted to do with the rugby and cricket teams is they ended up bringing in a quota system, whereby they wanted a certain percentage of the team to be made up of people of color. But where it failed originally was the fact that those people that they brought in were not necessarily the best players in their position to play those positions, because again, they didn't grow up playing the sport because they weren't allowed to, or they rebelled against the sport, or their parents rebelled against the sport. So it's only sort of now that you see an entire generation of players and that have grown up from knee-high to a grasshopper playing rugby and doing basically developing those skills to make them incredibly talented rugby players. And at the moment, one of the turning points in the way that the Springboks are seen by the vast majority of the country is Siya Kolisi being named Springbok captain. He's the first black African Springbok rugby captain, and he's also the first black African captain to lift the Rugby World Cup in 2019. And that was seen in South Africa as a very particular turning point, because up until that point, only the white Afrikaner was captain. That was their position. That was it was that role. And when Rassie Erasmus, the then head coach of the Springboks, made the decision to make Siya Kolisi captain, there was a loud minority that said that it was affirmative action. That was the only reason he was captain, and he wasn't even. And there was calls to saying he wasn't even the best player to play his position. But since then, he's gone on to prove every single doubter wrong, and he's one of the best leaders in the world, at least in rugby. And you can see it on the pitch. Everyone would die for him on the pitch. And what makes him particularly unique and a particularly brilliant unifier in South Africa is where he came from. So he came from a town called Zwaida in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. incredibly poor family, a township basically, and he was raised by his grandmother, and he eventually got a scholarship to play rugby at one of the very prestigious private schools in South Africa, and he fought his way up through playing rugby to the position where he is now, where he literally watched the 1995 World Cup final in a shebeen, which is basically like a speakeasy / illegal pub in the townships. He was very young at the time, so he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't drinking, obviously, but the shebeens had TVs, and he basically watched Chester Williams in particular and run Pienaar lifting the World Cup, and the iconic Nelson Mandela moment after the final. He watched that in a township, and when he saw that sort of thing, he made it his mission to want to play rugby, and obviously the rest is history, sort of thing. And from that turning point, we've seen a vast growth in participation in rugby across the board, in terms of particularly in the previously underprivileged parts of the country. And right now, without looking at the quota system, this is the most culturally diverse South African rugby team ever, and every single player deserves to be there. Whereas 10 years ago, you could argue that X was there because of the color of his skin, or Y was there because or whatever. Now there's not a single player on that in that Springbok squad that you can say is there because he's quote unquote a quota player, which is probably which basically suggests exactly how far South African rugby has come in the last 25 years, however long it's been since 1995. I can't do maths. 27 years. It's a long story short, sort of sums up the history of where it all came from. Because of Siya Kolisi in particular, the South African rugby team is seen as a much more unifying and much more representative of the country as a whole than it ever has been. Again, as I say, it's not everyone will agree with me, but the large portion of the country would say that it is still it represents South Africa finally.
Awesome. That's one of the things that rugby, like, it's interesting. I think every in-group or every group of people likes to think they're the virtuous ones, right? But rugby definitely has that pat yourself on the back kind of culture of we're the good guys, we are respectful.
Good old rugby values.
Rugby values, yeah. Sure, mismanagement, but anyway. That's incredible, and I guess and thank you for the history lesson. To widen out the context, sports in general. Obviously, football World Cup's happening right now. It's the biggest event in the world, arguably. And some people, who don't identify maybe as sports people don't get it, or they don't see the value. So on a more philosophical level, why do you think sports drive such passion in people, and how would you make the argument that sports, are valuable to society as a whole?
Ooh, that's a very existential question. You're questioning my entire career. No. Well, to answer the first point, I think what I think is drives that passion in a lot of people to support their sport or whatever. It could be. It probably starts at a young age. People that played the sport and, like myself, eventually couldn't play it on any further, but still wanted to be connected to their childhood and what they grew up playing. But I think the passion and the support for a team, or the support for a club, or whatever it is you're so passionate about on a sporting aspect, probably comes from an inbuilt sort of tribalistic element in a lot of people, from a desire to belong to a system that is not necessarily that you have no control over, but you and everyone else around you is in favor, or it wants them to do well, if that makes sense. So exactly, but like you can't really contribute to them to a large, because obviously support is support, but at the end of the day, the players are going to play with or without you, and there's nothing really that you can do as a supporter to improve that. But it's more, I think it's just the collective thing of something greater than myself that I can become a part of. A community really is the best way. It's like there's tribalism in the sort of rivalries on the pitch and off the pitch, and the football fans are particularly strong on the rivalries, where they have home and away fans, and the two can't actually mix in the stadiums because otherwise bad things will happen. But that's a tribalistic aspect, but the broader community aspect is it's almost a way of escapism as well, because for a large part of the population, they can watch sport and not have to worry about their own problems or problems in the rest of the world if they happen to be brought to the attention via sport, like for example what's going on in Qatar, the war in Ukraine, racism, Black Lives Matter, the anti-apartheid stuff back in before 1995 as well. All of that sort of took place on the sports field. But aside from those things, a lot of people gravitate to sport because there is none of that. You can just sit down, watch 3 hours of entertainment, think back to when you used to play the sport, and it would connect you in a way to other human beings on the planet. Even if you're watching it at home, you still feel connected to every other Springbok rugby supporter that were watching the Springboks beat England on Saturday. Like that is how you that's how you function. The broader aspect of sport in general, though, and why it benefits society, to use the famous rugby values sort of phrasing, it creates a sense of community, it creates a sense of teamwork, and it teaches you ways to overcome obstacles. Like if you're facing, like it's the most, even in the non-contact sports, it's still one of the more violent ways of approaching a challenge, in a sense. So it goes back to, again, early human, what's built in you, I think, that is the desire to overcome challenges through physical attributes or physical force. So take football, for example. If you're going up against a very solid high-line defense, it's your physical ability to get around it that is what drives you, as opposed to outthinking somebody. I mean, granted, it's you can outthink them and still be physically outmaneuver them at the same time, and that's arguably how it works. But there's just that it forms a general. I don't know. It's difficult to really explain, to be honest. How.
I think anything that is real to the participants is real as like a baseline. So like the existence of God, the existence of love. These things are hard, intangible in some way. They are intangible, but they're real because they have a real effect on the world. And I think sports is similar because, like, to use an anecdote from where I'm from in Philadelphia in the United States, it's the NFL team is the Philadelphia Eagles. And that's like, it's just assumed there that you are, so anyone who lives there or is from there is an Eagles fan. And there's that constant click of connection. So I think that's why it kind of reminds people of where they're from to represent and be represented by a group, and gives them something to, like you said, a distraction. So yeah, I heard, I just heard someone say, like, sports are stupid, and I was like, I mean, would you say art is stupid too? Because how would you define art? I would define art as something that makes, for the artist, is a way to express, and for the recipient is something that it moves them or makes them think. And so, using those definitions, right, that's exactly what sports does. So, it's kind of interesting. I don't think anyone's really trying to cancel sports, but I just think it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I think, but yeah, like as you rightly point out, like people have their own ideas around sports. They think, oh, it's like there are dangers of sport, and I can understand the argument why people would say maybe you should stop playing it, especially with concussions and long-term effects of concussions. But there's ways that we can make the sport safer, and obviously rugby is working on it, particularly trying to lower the tackle heights and trying to improve HIAs, head injury assessments on the field. Basically, if you get hit if anywhere you get hit on the head, you've got to do a test on the side of the pitch that determines whether or not you've got a concussion, and if you display certain symptoms, then you get stood down for the rest of the game. Much like I believe that they have similar protocols in the NFL. But like I get the argument where a lot of people will say I mean stupid is one thing, but dangerous is probably the other way to put it for a lot of sports. And I can understand the argument there, but then the counter argument to that would be, in general, just being active is in and of itself a healthy pursuit, and the fitness levels that you need to be at in order to play incredibly high intense sports like soccer, NFL, American football, rugby. I wouldn't put cricket in that bracket because I don't know. There's not a whole lot of running to do in cricket, but like exactly, it's just like baseball. But yeah. There's the benefits, I think, far outweigh the cons, and I mean sport's not for everybody. Like people can say it's stupid, and then they'll go and play 3 hours of gaming, and that's also perfectly valid. I might not necessarily say it's not for me, but if people enjoy it and it's a way of escapism, then great. Don't beat down on somebody's passion.
Yeah, for sure. So with the Bro Nouveau podcast, what I'm doing is promoting the Bro Nouveau mindset, right? And that's going to be more expressive, more reflective, more empathetic, and giving them kind of permission to be themselves as opposed to kind of being in the predefined box. And it started off with this kind of search of mine to define what's the opposite of like bad masculinity, right? Because we have plenty of examples of how not to behave, but there's not a lot of great discussions about, what should our boys be looking up to? How should one define himself as a good man? So is this something you've thought about, and how do you kind of move through the world thinking about that? Assuming, you seem to be a good guy, so I'm assuming you're trying to be a good person.
Yeah. So South Africa is one of the... It's got a very bad reputation and a very bad statistical proportion of gender-based violence, which is something that the South African society at large is actively trying to combat and trying to get rid of toxic masculinity. So I myself am a huge proponent of being anti-toxic and trying to sort of find ways to reduce that sort of thing. So rugby as well has a bit of a reputation in certain parts of the world that has that sort of toxic masculinity attached to it, unfortunately. Now, people say it's getting better in locker rooms and in dressing rooms, and the whole locker room talk thing that went. So obviously, I know the Americans know it all too well. That thankfully, I've been from what I've heard that sort of that's been improved, particularly in a lot of sports dressing rooms. But what I strongly believe in is, if you see something that you disagree with, be it your friend saying something about this woman or non-binary person, and you know that it's wrong, call them out. Like, sometimes it might not be quote unquote safe for you to call out some. I mean, it's not necessarily a friend. Anyone. If you see any sort of toxic masculine behavior, the best thing to do is to call it out tell them to stop. And I mean, granted, I say it might not be a safe space for you to do it, but my feeling is always it's even less safe for the woman in the picture. So, I mean, I'm not going out and telling people put yourself at risk and go get beat up, but if men as a society don't call each other out every single time they say something or they do something that displays that toxic masculinity, we're basically telling the people in that area that okay, it's okay. What I've just said there, that's all right. I can say it again. Whereas if you stop it as soon as you hear it, it starts to go in like, okay, maybe this actually isn't something that I can say, and maybe this isn't something that I can do, and that will change the mindset as generations go on. But I also think because we like the younger generation at the moment, I'm not blaming everything on the older people. Like the old generation is not necessarily or everything bad with the world, but the young generation at the moment is far more in tune with what can and can't be said and what should be. I mean, obviously there's always the bad pockets, and I'm not going to paint everything with a nice broad brush, but I have noticed in particular anyone under the age of 30, you're either incredibly toxic or you know exactly what like, yeah, it's there's no sort of in between anymore. Like, whereas before everyone had that little bit in them, now it's either you're incredibly one way or you are woke. And I hate the term woke because it's been so. But like, the way Ireland actually have a nice word for it, sound. So if you're sound, that means you're a good person. You're like, and I think the majority of the people under 30 are sound. It's just the other people that go the complete opposite direction. But yeah, I think it starts with the individual and calling out every instance that you see, and also taking steps to make sure you catch yourself. Because some people, I mean, myself growing up, because we didn't know any better, we got into certain. I mean, I went to an all-boys school as well, so it was very, very masculine-centric and very toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity was rife in the school. It's different now, thankfully, but we didn't know any better. We were surrounded by boys our own age, and this was what we thought was cool. So I had to unlearn all of that when I got out of school and went to university, when I realized that everything that I'd learnt was, well, it wasn't even learnt, it was sort of ingrained in me from my peers and all that sort of thing. I had to sort of unlearn all of that, and that is another way that anyone that isn't growing up but is currently in the midst of a midlife crisis, they can unlearn all the toxic masculinity that they've just absorbed through going through life in general. But that's an active step that you have to take, and you have to actually understand why saying certain things about other people or acting in a way that makes other people uncomfortable is not okay. You have to understand and also you have to understand what makes, like, I'm 6'4", I'm a very large man. I am not a danger to anyone on the street, but because of my size, because of my gender, I'm automatically assumed to be a danger, and that's not my fault. That's society's fault. But I must take steps to make sure that other women on the side of the street or other non-binary people on the side of the street do not see me as a threat. Be it take a few steps, slow down. If you feel like you're making the person in front of you uncomfortable, acknowledge your privilege as a large white man, and say, okay, you know what? Actually, that person is uncomfortable because I appear to be following them. I'm going to slow down a bit to make sure that they have enough space, or cross the street, or do something to make them comfortable in the position in the place that they are. Even if it means you going out of your way a little bit, and slowing down or crossing the street. What is that?
Right. Yeah, totally. I love that, man. That's very self-aware of you. Because that stuff does matter. I think another example of something that I took for granted and had to learn was I went and played on a gay rugby team in San Francisco. Like in the San Francisco thing. I think I grew up with a pretty, also all-boys school, but, we were on that cusp of different mindset. I had, strong role models in my mom and my sister. So I was kind of, had these ideas of like, okay, like, let's not think we're better than anyone else or assume that men are a superior gender or anything like that. So I kind of had this conception, but still being a straight guy playing in a straight sports environment, I never got the gay perspective. Until one of my friends told me, you know what, dude, you're the first straight guy who I've ever been friends with, and who I haven't been, intrinsically threatened by, I guess, because of their previous experiences. And that really blew my mind, and it was really sad.
Yeah.
That is a bummer. That's not. We don't want that.
No, exactly.
Representative of everyone, every gay person. Obviously, it was just that one person, but just the fact that the society had created that condition was telling.
Yeah, but I think something that also sparks that is almost in a way an inability for men to embrace femininity, if that makes sense. Or like traditionally feminine things like expressing feelings and hugging, for example.
Yep. Saying I love you to your close people.
Exactly. Like that's something that's society, not just men, but general society. A lot of women say it's quote unquote gay to tell you how they feel, or say to tell you to tell them how you feel. So it's not just men that need to unlearn a lot of the toxic masculine traits. Like the general society needs to be more accepting of every sort of everyone's sort of ideas behind femininity, masculinity. Like women can be masculine, men can be feminine. It is legitimately what you're feeling, and there shouldn't be a sort of one way or the other, and you have to be tough, you have to be strong, you have to be this all the time.
Totally. And the flip side is that there is examples of it going too far. Right? Like we both said, like the woke mob is something that isn't necessarily productive. So how do you conceptualize of the next generation then, and say you were to have kids? How would you coach up your sons and daughters in that sense? Because we've kind of had this strong movement with our generation away from the bad stuff and defining the bad stuff, but there's also almost we kind of change the script, there's going to be a gap, right? So how do you think about not going too far, and how do you also accommodate for the middle ground and the nuances where, of course, we're not always going to be angels, right? So how do you tackle with that?
I mean, I don't necessarily know if I want kids. That's the one thing. Some nice easy cop out there. No, to be honest, I think let kids be themselves. I don't think you can really go too far. Like I don't know how too far is, and like. Yeah, I always think that as long as whoever it is being themselves and not harming other people by being themselves, there's no real way. There's no going too far. Like as long as my existence or my kid's existence doesn't infringe on the existence of somebody else, and subsequently that person's existence doesn't infringe on the existence of my kids. I think as long as they are themselves and they are kind, respectful, and empathetic towards other people, that's the best way to raise them in a way. Is like boy, girl, or whatever you want, or whatever you have as a kid, they've just basically just raised them to respect other people's existences and not think that they deserve more or less rights than anyone else, because everyone is equal. It's human rights. Everyone is human.
I like it. So instead of kind of focusing on a certain outcome or over-defining, stick to the basic values and be consistent, and then let the next generation kind of chart their own course with some strong foundation.
Yeah, the best way to put it is, in South Africa we have a term called Ubuntu. It's a Bantu word. It basically means I am because we are. It's community. It's you can call it a communism in a way, but not the political system. More the everyone is there for everyone else, and if you think that you're better than somebody, the entire system collapses. It's basically, Ubuntu is like a table, and everyone is a leg. Once one leg tries to get on top of the table, it falls. So, just have Ubuntu. Have a belief that you are part of the system and not above the system, and that's you can't. Don't be a dick. Just don't be a dick.
For sure. Good. We have I had a touch rugby group in oh no, this is my college coach would always say that, like, if we were playing touch and someone would like kick or like do something stupid, he'd always just scream like, "Don't be a dick."
It's my life motto.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome, man. Stephen, thank you so much for your reflections and your openness, man. I think certainly fulfilling the goal of the podcast. And for people who want to find your work, your reading, your reporting, where can they head?
So I'm on Off the Ball. It's an Irish website and radio station primarily, but then also I'm on Twitter and Instagram mainly. So Stephen KG on Twitter and Stefan STEPHAN KG_photography on Insta. I don't have TikTok and I don't have YouTube, so those are the only places you'll be able to find me.
Nice. Awesome, man. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And
yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great chatting to you too.